Making Sense of the National Security Strategy. My name is Matthew Koenig, and I'm Vice President and Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Last week, the Trump administration released its national security strategy, the administration's flagship document that lays out its foreign policy vision and the threats and opportunities facing the United States. Why is a national security strategy important? How does it inform U.S. policy? And what does it mean for U.S. and allies and partners around the world? Today's event will answer these questions and more. Convenings like this are central to the Scowcroft Center's mission of developing sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and its allies. The center also honors General Scowcroft's legacy of service and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership and cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. And General Scowcroft was famous when he was National Security Advisor, when he was briefed with an emerging issue to challenge his staff with the question, so what's the strategy? So it's appropriate the Scowcroft Center today is coming together to ask, so what's the strategy? Today's event is public and on the record, and if you wish to submit a question to our experts, please visit askac.org online and you can submit your question there. I'd now like to turn over to the moderator for today's discussion, Tressa Gunov, and Tressa is the Scowcroft Center's Director for Programs and Operations. So Tressa, over to you.
Matt, thank you very much. I just want to take a second to introduce our panel. It's a wonderful panel from across the council and from Scowcroft. We have Jason Marzak, Vice President and Senior Director of the Adrian Arsht Latin America Center. Ambassador Rama Yade, the Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Africa Center, and Tori Tausig, the Director of the Scowcroft Center Transatlantic Security Initiative. So a really great group today. As Matt said, submit your questions via askac.org, and we're going to jump right in. Matt, for you first, let's talk about what this strategy means for great power competition. It seems to minimize or to shift the way great power competition has traditionally been interpreted by the United States, particularly with respect to China, sort of the axis of aggressors, consisting of China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran aren't discussed in that way at all. So I'd love to get your take on what you think about this and how this is going to work in practice for the United States.
Yes, thanks, Tressa. And overall, I thought this was a good weaknesses, and I think this is one of them. The Trump administration deserves a lot of credit for ushering in the era of great power competition and recognizing that in the 2017 National Security Strategy. This one is light on that. The North Korea is not mentioned at all. Iran is mentioned as essentially a problem that's already been solved. The Russia threat is presented as kind of squabbling between Moscow and European allies that the United States needs to moderate. And then China is not really called out as the comprehensive threat that it is. And then, moreover, the linkages among these adversaries is not called out. So I think that is a weakness of the strategy. Now, it does, though, talk about winning the technology and economic competition. Presumably, that's the competition with China. It talks about maintaining U.S. military dominance, nuclear deterrence, missile defense. So who is this military meant to deter? Presumably, China. So it is a little bit puzzling because actually executing the strategy will lead to competition with China, but the competition is never really called out explicitly. And some have wondered why that might be. One answer may be that there are these ongoing trade negotiations, and there was a worry that being too tough on China might upset them. But you're right that it is a omission in the document.
Thanks for that. One thing I think that we need to think about as we review this strategy is how it's going to be perceived around the world. And a group that has often been discussed as this kind of group of hedging countries that are looking to balance themselves out between multiple power structures, whether it's regionally or globally. And if you're a hedger, so to speak, a hedging country, how do you think this strategy lands? And how do you think it will affect this idea of U.S. primacy in the world, regardless of these smaller countries and how they might perceive this strategy for themselves? And this is for Matt, too.
Oh, well, thanks, Tressa. And, we have some experts, Jason on Latin America and Rama on Africa. So I'd be interested in their take. But it does seem like there are some things in the strategy that would be attractive to the swing states. I'm sure Jason will speak to this, but I think our partners in the Western Hemisphere have often felt like the United States pays more attention to Africa region. Also, for both Western Hemisphere and Africa, there's discussion of increased economic investment, in part to counter China's engagement in the region. And so I also think that increased economic cooperation would be welcome. But Jason and Rama are the deep regional experts, so I'd welcome their thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, Jason, let's turn to you.
Well, thanks so much, Tressa, and great to have this conversation. Look, I think from the outset, this is a national security strategy that makes it very clear, as I wrote last week, that the Western Hemisphere is now the United States' top priority. There is over 3 pages of the strategy dedicated to the Western Hemisphere. Matt was making the comparison of this strategy versus the 2017 strategy of the first Trump administration, in which the Western Hemisphere got about a page. And you look at the different goals that were laid out, deterring organized crime, combating against trafficking of drugs, foreign actors, reducing the influence of foreign actors across the hemisphere. Actually, look back at 2017, and both reducing foreign actor influence and organized crime were actually both figured pretty prominently in the Western Hemisphere section of the president's first national security strategy. What's different is also the focus here on what has been a concern for the U.S. for many years, but is now laid out in this strategy, which is how do we actually secure access to critical supply chains across the Western Hemisphere, a hemisphere that's rich in natural resources and critical minerals that are all critical for U.S. competitiveness. But also making sure that the foreign actors' influence in strategic areas is reduced. Migration, of course, figures prominently in the strategy as well with regard to the Western Hemisphere. But there is very much as well, Tressa, there's a focus on the economy as well. And I'll call out the fact that there's a sense twofold. One is the fact that development of economies in the hemisphere have to benefit U.S. commercial interests. That makes sense given the president's priorities. But there's also a second portion of that, which is also that it makes clear that development of local economies is actually in the interest of the United States as well. And so when you look at the two broader priorities of this strategy with regard to the Western Hemisphere, which I'll say are security and the economy, those are actually the top two issues for most countries across the hemisphere. I mean, voters go and they vote based on the security in their own countries. We're going to have an election in Chile this coming Sunday. Security and the economy are the two top issues in which voters are going to be decided between the two candidates. And security issues, organized crime, Tressa, has become even more prominent, even more of a concern across the hemisphere. Now, the question is going to be what exactly are the tools that are going to be deployed to be able to address insecurity and to further develop economies. Now, within that, I'll call out the fact that there's a specific mention on the economic side to many of the tools that the U.S. government has at its disposal that we actually haven't used as much in the past across the hemisphere. And I think there's a real opportunity. The strategy mentions the Development Finance Corporation. We're currently in the midst of DFC reauthorization. There's been a lot of discussion. We've done a lot of work at the Atlantic Council on how to make the DFC more nimble and also more responsive to the needs. And that regards goes to the criteria for priority consideration across the hemisphere. A focus on and the strategy as well on the Exim Bank, the Millennium Challenge Corporation. But I'll end here, Tressa, and say that what also, whether it's the economy or whether it's security, what's also a through line in the Western Hemisphere component of the strategy is how to reduce the influence of foreign actors, whether it's in economies or within other strategic assets for the United States across the hemisphere?
Yeah, and that's an excellent question. I want to get to that in just a little bit, Jason. But Rama, over 50 countries in Africa, how is this going to affect their own sort of domestic power considerations and how they'll approach U.S. Agendas in Africa, including on, the critical mineral front, but also the economic front and sort of this trade not aid approach that the administration seems to be taking in the region?
Thank you very much for this important question. And first, maybe I should start by noticing something everybody noticed. Africa in this national strategy, it's 3 small paragraphs at the bottom and last page of the document. That's right, and not surprising because even during the campaign last year between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, there has been no mention of Africa, in the debates. So not surprising. But however, I must say that these paragraphs don't reflect the importance of Africa. First, Africa, it would be in 20 years, 2.5 billion people. Africa is the largest free trade area in the world. Africa, it's the biggest digital revolution in the world. It's consumers, clients. It's a driving force of the future and even of the present. And many global powers. I mean, all the global powers and increasingly the regional powers have understood that. Whether it's China, a trade that is 5 times more in terms of volume higher than with the US. Russia use Africa to feed the war against Ukraine every day, not to mention the propaganda. See how France is unhappy after being ousted from West Africa because they know the cost of it. Africa, it's 28% of the UN votes. So it's a lot. And the regional power, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, who host the DRC Rwanda peace talks. There's a reason for that. The Emirates, soon the first investor in Africa, Turkey, India. So that is the importance of Africa. It's not a document that can say Africa is important. It's not. It's just the reality that says that, and the entire world recognize that. First thing. Second thing, I think despite that, this document does not, in this paragraph, don't reflect everything that has been accomplished this past year under the Trump administration. And it's not a matter of size. All these pages dedicated to Europe, not sure Europeans are happy of the content. Maybe it's better to be small and strong than large and maybe feeling being undermined or questioned, or all the transatlantic relationship is in question right now. So and it takes a lot of pages to explain that and why. So what is the content? Like I said, Africa unexpectedly became a major focus of Donald Trump second term foreign policy, despite, I should say, low initial expectation across the continent. It has been a high tension second season. And you mentioned the USAID shutdown. The USAID shutdown is not an African matter. Africa was not the first receiver of USAID funds or the US assistance funds. The first one was Ukraine. The second one was Israel. The third one was Jordan this past decade. Africa was not the first one. And Africa did not rely on that. The first donor in Africa, the first donors are Africans. It's the remittances from the diaspora, 5 times higher than any world global assistance. Those who support Africa are Africans first. This is important to know. Second, this assistance was not for dedicated to humanitarian issues first. It was for governance, economic development, military support. So it was not directed to the African continent first. And also, I would add that after talking with many African leaders, they said, we wanted to move away from assistance because assistance has never developed anything, any country. So they have been able to replace the missing funds very quickly in health, for example, which was problematic, was more about hotspot like Sudan, DRC, where food, medicines were blocked into the ports. That's what the NGOs testified about. That's right. But for the rest, the trade shift is something that was expected and wished by African economies themselves.
Thank you. Tori, turning to you, Europe does get a lot of attention in this strategy, and maybe somewhat to its chagrin, but there's a lot that is to unpack in the section on Europe, right? Take us through what the most notable things are, particularly about Russia, about Europe's strength economically, and its relationship to the United States as a vital security partner. But talk about the whole thing. It is a lot to unpack, and just start with the security piece first, though.
Great. Thank you very much, Tressa, and thank you for the opportunity to join this panel. I think if we look at the European section, this is the section I think that highlights first and foremost the weaknesses of this national security strategy and the incoherence of this national security strategy. There are some sections where the primary threats align more with the administration's goals and strategies for achieving them. And I really think this Europe section is where, again, we see the weaknesses highlighted of this strategy more so than in other regional elements. And why is that? One, the primary threats, which I think we could outline facing Europe as being a conventional threat from Russia, are not outlined here. The administration's goal of ramping up burden sharing on the European continent and having Europe stand on its own 2 feet to take on the conventional threat from Russia are not outlined here. And the administration's strategy for getting Europe to take on greater security burden sharing is not mentioned here. What is mentioned instead? It's kind of instead a cacophony of different threats with very little emphasis on how the administration seeks to address those threats in line with Europe. The primary threats as outlined in this section are the threat of, quote, civilizational erasure to European societies, the threat of overregulation, and the threat of free speech to European societies. This is very much in line with the speech that we heard Vice President Vance make earlier this year at the Munich Security Conference. And so it's not new to Europeans, but it, I think, discounts the preeminent security threats that Europe faces and instead focuses on these internal, somewhat subversive threats that, at the end of the day, will, I think, serve as a distraction for responsible European governments that are genuinely taking steps needed to strengthen their defenses against conventional threats from Europe. So a lot to unpack here, but I think the bottom line for me is that there really isn't a coherent strategy in place in this Europe section for what are the preeminent security threats facing Europe and the United States, what are the United States goals on the European continent, and how does the United States and this administration achieve them alongside allies and partners. That coherence is really not illustrated in this section.
Great. Thanks, Tori. Matt, I did want to turn to Asia Pacific. There is a lot of sort of a parallel call to Asia Pacific allies, particularly Japan and South Korea, to also achieve defense spending, much in the way that the administration has pressured Europe to do that. But talk to us about how the strategy aims to realize that, the actual execution part of that goal. And then also talk about what it says about the traditional commitments that the United States has had to Taiwan, and how that feels different this time.
Good. Thanks, Tressa. And let me just go back briefly to the overall strategy first, because I said I thought it was overall a good strategy and then started with the criticism. So on the good side, I think a good strategy tells you what's new or different, and this one did that with the focus on the Western Hemisphere. A good strategy also clearly lays out the goals, and it does that in some detail on page 5. Also reaffirms some of the traditional pillars of U.S. strategy, like nuclear deterrence, provides new answers to new challenges, like how to maintain technological leadership. So I do think there's a lot of goodness in the strategy. And Indo-Pacific, to your question, I think is another area that's fairly strong. I was out at the Reagan Defense Forum this weekend and talking to an Asian ambassador who was pleased with the contents on Indo-Pacific. It reaffirmed America's traditional view on Taiwan. There was a worry that the United States might weaken its language on Taiwan, but reasserted the conventional view that it doesn't want to see a unilateral change to the status quo made either by China or Taiwan. Also talked about maintaining deterrence in the region through military overmatch. Talked about securing supply chains and cooperating with allies to deal with the threat from China. So I thought overall the Indo-Pacific section was pretty strong.
Thanks. I wanted to turn to the role of China's role, certainly for all of your regions, because I think one of the things, and this is outlined in the Middle East section as well, there's a great kind of emphasis on commerce, on trade, and sort of turning the page, for instance, in the Middle East to a different kind of less security focused and more trade and economic and prosperity focused relationship. But China and Russia still do get a vote in how that strategy will be realized throughout all of your regions. And I know, Jason, in your case, China isn't really even specifically called out. It's sort of a specter that lies in the background to realizing U.S. goals in Latin America. But it definitely is going to be a factor and will continue to be a factor in all of your regions. So I wanted to go around to each of you to see how that's going to work in practice for the United States. Jason, I'll start with you because, again, it is not specifically named as China in Latin America, but it certainly is clear that China is the one that they're talking about in terms of the economic inroads that they've made in the region, whether it's in port infrastructure or just in broader economic deals. So what is your take on how the United States goal and this kind of America First approach is going to be realized in your region, and what adversaries or those who are looking to counter the U.S. will have a say on in that approach?
It's a great question, Teresa, and I'll start off by noting, which I didn't know my first answer, that when you look at the definition of what does success look like, or what are the goals of the strategy, specifically for the Western Hemisphere, the president lays out very clearly. And the strategy says enlist and expand. And what that means, as it is laid out, is enlisting countries to help to accomplish the goals of the strategy, specifically the security goals, but also, as you ask, the goals of, and yes, China's not mentioned specifically, but what is mentioned is adversarial foreign influence. And so that's China. That's also Russia in the hemisphere as well. You look at the Russian relationship with the Maduro regime in Venezuela. You look at the Russian relationship with the Ortega regime in Nicaragua. The Russian relationship with the Cubans. So adversarial foreign influence, yes, it's China, it's Russia, and there's other adversarial influences in the hemisphere as well. We've looked previously. There's historical context of some Iranian influence in parts of the hemisphere as well. So when you look at the Western Hemisphere section overall, no country is mentioned, not even any specific Latin American country or Caribbean country is mentioned in the Western Hemisphere section. But I think what's also important to note is the Western Hemisphere component has as I mentioned earlier, has a significant influence on the economy and how to help to strengthen U.S. interests, especially the U.S. private sector investment opportunities across the hemisphere. And I'll tell you, Teresa, when I travel across the hemisphere, I hear time and time again that countries want more U.S. private sector investment, and it simply does not come in a lot of the strategic areas that has been laid out in the strategy, including infrastructure, including ports, telecommunications. I mean, so what's laid on the strategy is not just the importance of that, but then the fact that there's a specific call outs for noting any type of opportunity for U.S. businesses, and then the commitment to marshaling now the collective resource of the U.S. government to help the private sector to compete. But back to your question on foreign influence, what's also noteworthy in the strategy is that the terms of our alliances, it says, must be contingent on winding down adversarial outside influence. And so there is a real tie-in to both the security side, but also the economic side. And greater partnership also means reducing the foreign influence in key sectors of economies that are vital to U.S. supply chains.
Rama, that specific call out isn't really clear on the Africa section, but of course, Russia and China have made tremendous inroads, China in particular, economic, military, diplomatic throughout Africa. And then also, of course, Russia has a sphere of influence that extends really from coast to coast in several countries. So, what is your take on their role in the U.S. achieving its goals or thwarting those goals, as it were, in Africa?
So of course the US are under pressure in Africa when it comes to competition with other global powers. We know that China, these past 20 years, China quite quietly advanced its agenda. Now China diplomatically is supported by all the African countries. So 54 minus Eswatini, which is the only one that supports now Taiwan. It's a major shift. I said earlier that Africa is 28% of the UN votes. That's something that needs to be reminded here. China is not only infrastructure and economy. It's about politics. It's about diplomacy and geopolitics. And in front of our board last week, I reminded that it started in 1971 when African countries supported China in getting a permanent seat at the UN Security Council at the expense of Taiwan, that has been expelled from the Security Council since then. And since then, the foreign minister of China dedicated its first visit at the beginning of the year to the African continent. It's the depth of gratitude mentioned by Mao Zedong. This was the first part, and it's still the case. Second thing is, economically speaking, I said, the volume of trade 5 times higher than the volume of trade with the United States. During the Liberation Day, or 3 weeks after the Liberation Day of April, at the White House, China decided to exempt tariffs for all the 53 African countries. So and also it's not only infrastructure anymore, it's also renewable energy, creative sector, media, etc. Russia is not about trade. It's very low, very weak. It's about security and propaganda. And the other regional powers, of course, are pressing here. Emirates will be the first investor in Africa very soon. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, India. That's a lot. And on the European side, the European Union altogether, European Union is the first one, the second investor in Africa. But if you look individually, France is still there, but has lost a lot. Germany, German companies are the most popular in Africa. But the European Union strategy is hindered by the migration policy. Because of the rise of populist movements, Africa is mostly seen as a threat, demographic threat, rather than an opportunity from the public opinion's perspective or the political parties. So that's where we are. And of course, I should mention the South-to-South cooperation that is increasingly bigger, the BRICS, of course. And yeah, there are many African countries now in the BRICS, Ethiopia, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Africa, of course, Ethiopia. But this is also something to look into seriously. Yeah, that's what I can say about the map, the geopolitical map. But the United States, even if economically are behind, they have assets only of these countries. None of these countries has. I mean, the US soft power still works in the youth, in African youth, from Silicon Valley to Hollywood. There's many global actors, players that have a huge importance in Africa. And that's why I do believe that there's not so much effort to make to recover US positions in Africa. But I would also say that on the security front, this is something that is always undermined under the Trump administration. But I mean, the year started, the Trump 2.0 started with bombings on Somalia to oust ISIS leader who was hiding there. And I think the peace agreement between DRC and Rwanda includes an important security part because it's about peace, not only critical minerals, but it's first and foremost about peace. And the third hotspot is Sudan. When MBS visited the White House 2 weeks ago, he mentioned the importance of Trump's involvement in the genocide, and Trump reacted very strongly, saying that it would, after Congo, it will be his next point of interest, which won't be an easy part because the regional powers that are involved in this war and backing the fighters are US partners. So there will be a lot of talks between the US administration and beyond the fighters, these regional powers from the Gulf. And the third and the fourth hotspot will be Sahel, because as you know, the regime, a branch from Al Qaeda, is very close to Bamako, the city capital of Mali. And there's a lot of fears if Mali collapses, what it would mean for the Sahel, which is the region marked by a coup belt these past years.
Thank you. Troy, I want to turn to you a little bit. The NSS, it states that that Europe maintains a significant hard power advantage over Russia. And I want to talk about China in a second as well. But it also argues that at the same time that Europe in the long run doesn't have the economic and military might necessary to remain a reliable ally in some ways. It kind of juxtaposes these things, and there's not a lot of clear explanation for the differences. But is that the case? Does Europe retain a hard power advantage over Russia as it's going to continue to assert itself from a military perspective as it continues to recapitalize, but also on the hybrid front as Europe has been facing intensification of that in recent months? How does this strategy treat that issue? And what do you think the truth is in terms of how Europe is positioned vis-a-vis Russia and its influence?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say on the hard power front, Europe as a whole, NATO as an alliance, is able to match Russia's military might and capabilities. It doesn't mean that Europe doesn't have a lot of work to do in terms of strengthening its own defenses and significant capabilities for challenging Russian conventional threats to the eastern flank or otherwise. But Europe, again, as a whole, within the NATO alliance and economically within the European Union, does outmatch Russia in terms of economic and military hard power. On the hybrid front, it's an excellent point. You know, we have seen in the last several months Russia ramp up its hybrid attacks on European territory. from increased air incursions, primarily what we saw in September with the significant drone incursion over Polish airspace. But we've also seen increased attacks, whether that be espionage, use of chemical weapons, or otherwise across the European continent. So I would say there, Europe has a lot of work to do to restore deterrence with Russia on the hybrid front. And we haven't seen NATO or individual allies come out strongly enough to reestablish that deterrence. So a lot of work to be done, both on the conventional and hybrid front, that I think this strategy again doesn't pay much attention to on the hybrid front. Really focuses on ending the war in Ukraine as first and foremost the way of restoring stability between Europe and Russia. But again, a lot of work to be done on ramping up European defense capabilities in order to meet future conventional threats from Russia as well.
And to that end, just talk a little bit about how you think China might factor into this. It's certainly not explicitly mentioned either vis-a-vis Europe, but there are a lot of efforts for the European Indo-Pacific cooperation that may or may not fall sort of within this strategy's ambit. And then also there is China's actual ambitions as it relates to Europe and to other places such as the Arctic.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think this strategy really had a missed opportunity for pushing Europe to focus more on evolving threats and challenges from the PRC. China is only referenced once directly in the Europe section of this strategy, and that's in reference to Europe and Germany in particular's external dependencies on China's economy and on Russian energy. But otherwise, China is not mentioned directly. We could see there's a list of 7 priorities that the administration outlines for its strategy in Europe. The 7th priority is on encouraging Europe to take action to combat overcapacity, technological theft, cyber espionage. I think we could allude that this is in reference to evolving threats from China, but again, not directly mentioned. And again, I think this is an own goal because at least what I've been hearing from Europeans across the continent for several months now is where is this administration going on China? How can we work with the United States to tackle shared challenges, to advance shared interests when it comes to threats that China poses to NATO's AOR, to Europe's economy? And this strategy doesn't really give Europeans much of a better understanding of where this administration and how this administration wants to work with Europe on China. Again, only referenced once directly, but doesn't outline a strategy for working together with Europe to combat these challenges from China. Last point on this, I would say this does go against, the Trump administration's initial national security strategy, but I actually think a lot of progress that the first Trump administration made in working with Europeans to take the threats from China more seriously on the European continent. We made a lot of progress working alongside Europeans, again, in the first Trump administration and in the Biden administration. And this strategy does not do much to further the momentum that, again, both Republican and Democratic administrations have sought with Europeans over the last 8 years.
Thanks, Tori. That's great summary there. Matt, I wanted to also, you alluded to earlier the technology and references to AI, technology, research, and other sort of economic ambitions that have clear national security implications. This strategy is different from the previous Trump national security strategy in that it doesn't drill down into issues like space, cyber, transnational threats, pandemics, some of those areas that are traditionally covered in national security strategies. Do you think that the decision not to cover those in depth means much to this strategy, or do you think it's at a level that those details sort of will fall into place if the strategy is implemented in their view? And specifically, I also think AI, if you can talk a little bit about that, how that plays into this, to the execution of this strategy would be very helpful to touch on.
Yes, well, I do think this is one of the biggest challenges facing the United States and the world, this new technology revolution with artificial intelligence, quantum computing, all these new technologies coming on at the same time with obvious implications for national security. We see it playing out on the battlefield in Ukraine. And so I do think it is a short document, 33 pages or so it doesn't go into a lot of depth in any areas, mercifully short in some ways. But I think it hits the right notes on technology. It recognizes that the United States has technological leadership. The world's most innovative economy recognizes that as a strength, and then says very clearly that the goal is to maintain U.S. Technological leadership. So I do think it points in the right direction in terms of what the goal should be. And you're right, a lot of topics that would have been covered in a longer strategy are not covered. I'm guessing the authors of the strategy would say that's part of what strategy is, of prioritizing and picking the issues that you think are most important for focus.
Thanks. I want to remind folks to please submit questions at askac.org if you have any. I'll continue with another sort of set of questions on the economic aspects of this, Matt, particularly vis-a-vis China. And how do you square the trade and by consequence tariff aspects of this strategy? Do you think it lays out a map that is realistic vis-a-vis Beijing's intentions as well, in terms of the economic growth with the United States and sort of turning the page on China as the traditional pacing challenge, that's been used so much in our traditional national defense strategies and other Department of Defense war documents in the past? Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Well, this is another area of tension, I think, in Trump administration policy and maybe also in the document. We know that President Trump likes tariffs and he's using them. But what is the purpose is not always clear. Sometimes it looks like he's using them for negotiation or leverage in trade negotiations to bring about freer and fairer trade, and there is a discussion of that in the document. At other times, President Trump has talked about how it is useful for generating revenue, in which case it would suggest that this is maybe a more permanent solution. So I think that is a tension that could have been resolved. And similarly, talking about China, there are a lot of sections of the document that are implying competition to China. The Indo-Pacific section talks about working with allies and partners to coordinate economic policy when it comes to securing supply chains. One of my favorite passages pointed out that the United States and its formal treaty allies together make up more than half of global GDP. So recognizing that with our allies, we're stronger. But then there's another passage that suggests if we can just get the trade relationship with China right, that we could put us on a path to, I think it said, a $40 trillion economy. So it does seem like maybe parts of the document were written by different people, some of them seeing China as an opportunity and others seeing it as a threat. And I think that's a tension that runs throughout the administration's policy.
Yes, I think this document does show at least different voices that we've heard from within the administration, and it looks like several of them have gotten, parts of their viewpoints into this document, but not all. I have a question, Jason. This is for you. Please comment on some of the obvious contradictions in the strategy. For example, getting closer to Russia while attacking Venezuela, which Russia supports. And I suppose there could be some question in here about, how much the administration is considering the full spectrum of interest of countries like Russia as it's doing its executing its policy in various regions and just from a broader military perspective as well as we've seen this build up. in recent weeks in the Southcom region.
Well, thank you. Look, when I look at some of the trusted, maybe some of the contradictions here, I think one thing important, you mentioned Russia, but I also think going back to China as well, and the strategy clearly notes a desire for countries across the Western Hemisphere to choose working with the United States rather than working with adversarial foreign powers. Now, the challenge is going to be in implementation because over the last 20 years, China in particular, its influence across the hemisphere is not just economic, but it's actually extended into soft power as well, into cultural influence, into military trainings. There's a whole host of ways in which China has embedded itself across the hemisphere. And what that also means is that countries across the hemisphere are very dependent economically on China as well as purchasers of raw commodities and also purchasing Chinese consumer goods. And so, what's going to be a challenge is this kind of us versus them idea in the strategy, which is something that most countries across the region don't want to have to choose between the U.S. or between what's deemed as adversarial foreign powers. Uh, the other aspect is the fact that the strategy clearly notes the economic and the security perspectives across the region. But as I noted, countries like China have found ways to be able to compete with U.S. influence in some of the areas in which the U.S. has traditionally outcompeted China. And China continues to double down those efforts as I mentioned. And so that's going to be a challenge in actually how to wean countries away from the Chinese sphere and how to do so in a way that no leader wants to choose again between the us versus them, between China versus the United States. On Russia specifically, there is I think the strategy makes it clear with regard to Venezuela that part of the strategy is to expand our partners across the hemisphere, and especially our partners that are working with us in key areas. And those key areas include things like reducing organized crime, reducing migration, and securing access to supply chains. And so, the more that a democratic government in Venezuela, where Edmundo Gonzalez had actually won the election a year ago, that government is one that would be much more amenable to U.S. interests.
Thanks for that, Jason. There's a question here, sort of, I think probably apropos for the Middle East. And I think that one of the statements in the strategy is that the United States is not going to hector countries anymore and is going to defer to their sort of traditions and their histories first. And I think we've seen Trump sort of try to crystallize that in his recent visit from MBS from the Saudis, and also another place where this idea of trade, tech investment, and sort of again a prosperity approach to the region is going to be prioritized. But Matt, I thought we could talk about the relationship with Israel. It is not described with the traditional words of ironclad or other types of traditional ways of speaking about the relationship between Israel and the United States, and nor is Taiwan, although they do make sort of the standard commitments to Taiwan. So these are two of the United States' most important strategic relationships. Can you talk about a little bit about Israel and then its broader approach in the Middle East? And then let's not forget Iran, which is not really focused on very much. It's sort of seems to turn the page on Iran after the U.S. strikes earlier this year. How is that still a factor in the region?
Well, thanks, Tress, and I'll comment on this, but then I think I'll turn it back to you too, because I know in your recent role as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Security Affairs, you were overseeing the Middle East and Europe and much else as well. But on the Middle East, it kind of reaffirms what the several past administrations, really going back to Obama, have tried to do, which is to pivot from the Middle East and focus more on other regions. And it says there's a passage here. Let's see, conflict remains the Middle East's most troublesome dynamic, but this is today less of a problem than headlines might lead one to believe. And so it does remind me a little bit of past administrations assuming they were going to pivot away and then being surprised, October 7th, the most recent example in the Biden administration. So we'll see if that holds up. And I think they're right that the strikes against Iran have defanged the axis of resistance and degraded the nuclear program. But I suspect that this problem hasn't been solved. It will reconstitute. But if I could, Tressa, turn it back to the moderator, I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Sure, I do agree with you there, Matt. I know that there's an optimism, particularly with the Gulf states, to focus on AI and other sorts of deeper, more advanced technologies. But in the end, the China consideration still applies to the Middle East as well. That is that, if you want to transfer high-end technologies, there are going to be questions from Congress. There are going to be questions for these super, F-35s and other major platforms because there are concerns about, Chinese exploitation of these and chips as well. And so that piece has a lot more work to be done in order to help realize that. And Iran is always in the background. I know this administration has focused a lot on sort of a post-Hezbollah and reconstruction in Lebanon and also related to Syria, and those are important goals. But Iran still isn't going to forget the decades that it's spent to build up its proxy networks in the region, Iraq, Syria, and other places, and of course in Gaza as well. So it has probably a to be continued little coda there for the region, but again, it's clear with the theme of interest-focused relationships that have mutual possibilities for making money in the region. So we're getting close to the end. I wanted everybody to do a quick round the horn. What do you think for 2026? Is this strategy is going to actually be applied and implemented? What are the most important things that the administration needs to pay attention to? And of course, we'll focus globally for you, Matt, but I'd love to hear how each of you see your regions in particular. How's this strategy realized? Matt, take us, let's go for Asia first, but then think about it globally as well from your strategy perspective.
Sure. And so first, I think I agree with the administration that the Middle East probably will be quiet in the coming year with Iran's capabilities set back. I think continued tension in the Indo-Pacific. We've seen China engaging in daily military coercion, but I don't think we'll see a major conflict in 2026. President Xi has said he wants to be able to invade Taiwan by 2027, which I think the other way of reading that is that he thinks he's not ready yet. So I suspect tension, but no conflict. And to step on Tori's turf a little bit and be interested in her view on this, I think getting a peace in Ukraine is going to be very difficult, despite the administration's, I think, sincere desire to get peace. I think it's going to be hard to find an agreement that works for both Putin and for Washington. And so I suspect continued conflict there. So I guess that's my look into 2026.
Tori, to that end, your views.
Yeah, just to pick up where Matt left off, I think goal number one for this administration in 2026 in the European theater is ending the war in Ukraine. We won't go into specifics now about what that looks like because I think there's still a fair amount of flexibility that the administration could pursue in how this war ends. So that's goal number one. Goal number two is strengthening, I would say, Europeans' defenses and shifting the burden of conventional defense from the United States as the traditional security guarantor for European security onto the shoulders of European allies. When I look at those two goals that the administration has laid out, not in this strategy necessarily, but as we've seen over the last several months, I agree with Matt. I think it's unlikely in terms of where we are now in negotiations with Ukraine that the war will end anytime soon. But I do think we are making progress on that second goal, which is strengthening burden sharing on the European continent. We see European allies stepping up to spend more on defense, to strengthen capability development, and I expect to see continued momentum on behalf of Europeans in achieving this goal.
Mhm. Thanks, Tori. Jason, your thoughts?
Well, I think, Tressa, the strategy lays clear. First off, the Caribbean deployment is not time bound. And there's been a lot of questions insofar as how long can we have such a significant number of our assets in the Caribbean, and by the strategy stating clear the Western Hemisphere is top priority, I don't expect that deployment to end anytime soon. And I think the strategy also makes it clear, as I looked at 2026 as well, that the U.S. is going to take significant interest in a lot of the key elections that are going to be happening across the hemisphere. We had a election that's currently still being disputed in Honduras. Still no winner. Back and forth on the vote counts. But the president made clear his preference for which candidate he preferred to win in that election. And so as the strategy is looking to enlist and expand partners across the hemisphere, I expect a great interest from the administration in some of these key elections that we have next year: Costa Rica, Peru, Colombia, Brazil. But also, of course, tomorrow, Maria Corina Machado is slated to receive the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo. There's been a significant focus from the administration, rightfully so, on Venezuela and the heinous acts that Nicolas Maduro commits and the implications of the Venezuelan people. So I expect a continued focus there. But also the strategy makes clear that just Nicolas Maduro leaving Venezuela is not a win. That actually there needs to be a government, as I was mentioning beforehand, that's actually about expanding our partners. And that means making sure that any change in Venezuela means bringing in the democratic government that was actually elected by the people of Venezuela a year ago. So I expect next year a lot of continued interest across the region, not only in the elections in Venezuela, but also in organized crime and in security issues that we all work on here at the Atlantic Council.
Rama, quick, just a few seconds remaining. Your views.
Okay. So 2025 was marked an unexpectedly intense year in U.S.-Africa relations, laying the groundwork for Trump's long-term strategy. Two major summits, Africa major summit, took place at the White House this summer and last week with the DRC Rwanda event. President Trump welcomed at the White House more African presidents than during his entire first term. So that's why I'm saying it has been more intense than expected. And the national strategy doesn't say anything about this importance for the best. The potential 2026 breakthrough should be twofold. First, securing the peace deal between DRC and Rwanda, because if it works, it's a 3-decade war that cost like 10 million lives. If it works, it will be he will go, it would be a major diplomatic achievement, and he will maybe replicate the same for the other African hotspots, Sudan and Sahel. And this is the second one expected in 26. the engagement promised on Sudan genocide and counterterrorism in the Sahel. So but if Trump wants a lasting legacy in Africa and makes the difference, he must tackle, I think, what is the most difficult, the most important challenge for Africans. Barriers in the dollar-based financial system, that's important. And Chinese cannot do anything about that. It's just the US, and global financial biases affecting African countries are also important. So only an ambitious structural approach like that can match the scale of Africa's challenges in what many call right now as the upcoming African century.
Yeah. Thank you for that excellent summary. Sorry we went a few minutes over, but we started just a few minutes late. So we're going to end here, though. There's so much more to talk about related to this strategy, including other issues like democracy, human rights, and other questions that we didn't get to in much depth this time. But thank you for joining today. It has been great to have you. And please stay in touch with us through the Atlantic Council, through the Scowcroft Center, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks so much.